Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. Thanks for joining me in this video. So at the end of the video, I'm going to put on the screen a couple of slides that you might want to check out and analyze on your own. Feel free to pause the video as you go. So the topic of this video, how the colonists were divided during the American Revolution. We often think of this period as a united struggle for independence, but the reality is much more complex. Not everybody in the colonies wanted to break away from Britain. In fact, the population was split into three major groups: Patriots, Loyalists, and Neutralists, sometimes called fence-sitters. Let's take a clear look at who these groups were and why they made the choices they did. Let's start with the Patriots. These were the colonists who actively supported independence from Britain. They made up roughly 40 to 45% of the population. Now, this group came from a variety of backgrounds: farmers, merchants, lawyers, even political leaders. You've probably heard of some of these big names among the Patriots: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, John Adams. So why were these people so determined to break away from Britain? Well, the Patriots felt the British taxation was unfair, especially since they had no representation in Parliament. Remember, no taxation without representation became a rallying cry. They believed the colonies deserved to govern themselves rather than being controlled by a king at a distance across the Atlantic. Patriots were especially common in places like New England and Virginia, where resentment against British control was strongest. They were the ones organizing protests, forming militias, and eventually leading the charge towards independence. Now, they of course were a diverse group of people, as each one of these groups were. Now, on the other side of this spectrum were the Loyalists. These folks made up about 15 to 20% of the colonial population and remained loyal to the British Crown throughout the conflict. They were sometimes called Tories, which was a political party in Britain at the time. So who were the Loyalists? Many were government officials, wealthy merchants, Anglican clergy, or people whose livelihoods depended on their connection to the British system. Some of them believed that staying loyal to Britain was the best way to maintain law and order. They feared that independence would bring chaos. Others simply thought the colonies would be stronger as part of the British Empire and didn't believe rebellion was worth the risk. Loyalists were especially concentrated in places like New York, the Carolinas, and Georgia. And here's a sad but interesting fact. After the Patriots won, many Loyalists fled the United States. Some went to Canada, others to Britain, leaving behind their homes, businesses, and lives to escape the anger of victorious Patriots. So Loyalists did face discrimination and sometimes even violence during the war and even after the war. And then we have the Neutralists, or the fence-sitters. This group, making up around 35 to 40% of the population, tried to stay out of the conflict altogether. Some of these were pacifists, like Quakers, which was very common in Pennsylvania at the time, who didn't believe in fighting under any circumstance. Others were just trying to survive. They weren't necessarily loyal to Britain, nor were they eager to fight for independence. They may have been uncertain about which side to take, or simply didn't want to risk the dangers of war. For these colonists, staying neutral was often a matter of practicality. They just wanted to protect their families, their farms, their businesses, regardless of who came out on top. It is important to remember that allegiances weren't always fixed. People switched sides throughout the conflict, and different areas of the colonies saw varying levels of support for each group. This wasn't just a war between colonists and the British. It was also, in many ways, a civil war between neighbors with opposing loyalties. Families were divided, friendships were broken, and communities were torn apart by the differing beliefs about what the future of the colony should be. So to recap, about 40 to 45% of the colonists were patriots, fighting for independence. Around 15 to 20% were Loyalists or Tories. They wanted to stick with Britain and remain part of the British Empire. And the remaining 35 to 40% tried to stay neutral, avoiding the conflict whenever they could. These divisions show us that the American Revolution wasn't just a simple story of good versus evil or right versus wrong. It was a time of difficult choices with real consequences for everybody involved. Before we leave, I am going to put on the screen a couple of images about the different allegiances. Some maps, some charts, some bullet points of information. So feel free to pause as you go. Have a great rest of the day.